When Diane Keaton passed away, Hollywood didn't cry, it fell silent. But in that silence, another story began to echo a love that never fit the rules, never wore rings, never needed promises. For nearly half a century, Diane Keaton and Al Pacino shared something the cameras could never capture. A devotion too private, too fragile, too real, and when she was gone, the words he finally whispered were the ones she had waited her whole life to hear. Because this isn't the end of a life, it's the truth behind the silence that followed. There was no camera flash, no red carpet, no final performance. Only the stillness of Brentwood, California, broken by the rustle of autumn leaves and a world struggling to absorb the loss. On October 11, 2025, Diane Keaton, the woman who gave voice to awkwardness, to honesty, to a generation of women who dared to be different, slipped away from life as quietly as she had once stepped into it. She was 79. There was no public funeral, no candlelight vigil, no celebrity statement on a velvet stage, just silence. And that silence said more than words ever could. In a city that celebrates spectacle, Diane's departure was an act of rebellion. One last quiet truth in a world addicted to noise. Hollywood didn't weep on cue this time. It froze, as if the sky itself had forgotten how to shine. The Walk of Fame didn't glitter that night. The billboards didn't blink, because one of its brightest lights had chosen to go without goodbye. And for days, the silence grew. Her family mourned in private. Her closest friends respected her wish. No eulogies, no tributes, no final curtain calls. Just a closing scene unspoken. Except for one voice, Al Pacino. A man who had walked beside her not always hand in hand, but always soul to soul. A man who had shared more than just screen time. For years, he said nothing. Not during the decades after they parted. Not during the interviews filled with rumors. Not when she adopted her children. Not even when he won awards and she stood quietly in the crowd. Always close, always silent. But now he spoke. He didn't call a press conference, didn't write a memoir, didn't offer a speech wrapped in sorrow. When a reporter caught him leaving his building in New York, eyes red, hands trembling, he said only 4 words: "I love you forever." He didn't need to explain. He didn't need to clarify whom he meant. The world already knew. Because this wasn't a love story made for headlines. It was made in glances, in unspoken promises, in decades of quiet devotion. It was a story of what might have been, and what always was in the spaces between the scripts. That single sentence became the eulogy Diane never wanted. The confession she never demanded. The ending she never needed, because in their story, the love never ended. Hollywood tried to write headlines. Pacino breaks silence, the woman he never married. But nothing captured the truth, because the truth was never loud. It lived in the silences they both shared, in the fact that even after their parting, they never truly left each other. She never wore a wedding ring. Not once in her 79 years did Diane Keaton walk down the aisle. No white dress. No vows exchanged under a sun-drenched canopy. No teary-eyed, "I do." And yet few women have loved or been loved as deeply as she was. For decades, the tabloids framed it as a mystery. Why would a woman so adored, so magnetic, choose solitude? They called it eccentric. They called it tragic. But the truth was far more powerful. Diane didn't fear love. She feared losing herself inside it. And Al Pacino, the only man who ever came close, understood that. In her memoir, Then Again, Diane admitted she had always been drawn to complexity, to men who didn't fit the mold. But it wasn't until Sonny Boy Al Pacino's long-buried reflections that the world saw the other side. "We found a tempo that was right," he wrote. "A rhythm not defined by rings or rituals, but by presence." She didn't need his last name. He didn't need her promises. Their love was not a destination. It was a state of being. Quiet, stubborn, and fiercely private. They lived in 2 separate apartments, took separate vacations, sometimes went days without speaking. But when Diane walked into a room, Al's eyes always found her first. And when she left, she always looked back just once to see if he was still watching. He always was. They were each other's mirror and their contradiction. Diane with her oversized hats and nervous laughter, Al with his brooding silences and fire beneath the surface. She was sunlight wrapped in neurosis. He was thunder hidden behind shadows. But together they made sense, in the way that chaos sometimes does. They never lived together. They never planned a wedding. But they shared scripts, dinners nights in rehearsal halls. And more than anything, they shared time. The kind of time that builds something no one else can see, but the 2 living inside it. There was no anniversary to celebrate, no wedding photo to display. But when Diane adopted her children, she did so alone, knowing perhaps that love didn't need a co-parent. It needed strength. And she had enough for all 3 of them. Still, the absence of a yes did not mean the absence of a heart. "I've had some lovely men in my life," she once said, smiling that half-crooked smile. "But I've never needed a husband to feel loved." And Al, he said less. But when asked about Diane in interviews, his answer was always the same. A pause, a look toward the distance, and then softly. She's something else. Some people wait a lifetime for a woof that fits into a frame. They had one that didn't need one. Because sometimes the most beautiful love stories are not the ones that end in weddings, but the ones that never end at all. It didn't begin with fireworks, no violins, no dramatic slow motion. It began in a casting room, a simple audition. A nervous young actress flipping through her script. A silent actor sitting in the corner, almost invisible. And yet something happened in that room. Something Francis Ford Coppola noticed before either of them did. Diane Keaton had just come off the stage, still unknown to most of Hollywood. Her mannerisms were odd charming. Her eyes sharp, yet searching. She wasn't like the others, not polished, not poised. She was real. Raw. Al Pacino, on the other hand, was the mystery. Small in stature, shy in presence, but with a fire that burned behind his reticent gaze. Paramount didn't want him. He didn't look like a star. He barely spoke. But Coppola saw it solved them. 2 people who didn't belong anywhere else except in the same frame. She auditioned for the role of Kay Adams, Michael Corleone's love interest. And when she read her lines across from Al, the room shifted. It wasn't chemistry, not the Hollywood kind. It was something quieter, something aching, a subtle recognition, as if 2 loners had just found their matching silence. That scene, Kay asking Michael about his family, about his world of secrets and codes, wasn't just acting. Diane wasn't playing Kay. She was Kay. Curious, vulnerable, stubbornly hopeful. And Al wasn't acting either. He was Michael, withdrawn, conflicted, yet drawn to a light he didn't know how to hold. In that first exchange, they weren't pretending. From that moment, they were tethered. Not lovers, not yet. But 2 souls marked by the same scar, the fear of losing control, and the deeper fear of never being seen. On set, Diane would joke to calm the tension. Al would disappear between takes, immersing himself in silence. But she noticed him, the way he stood alone, how he barely touched his food, how his eyes never rested, always restless, always searching. And he noticed her too. The way she carried herself unafraid to be awkward. The way her laugh broke tension like sunlight through fog. The way she made him feel not like a legend in the making, but like a man who could be known even when he didn't know himself. They weren't just co-stars. They were each other's refuge in a world that demanded masks. That first meeting wasn't scripted to be romantic. But sometimes destiny wears quiet shoes. It doesn't kick the door open. It slips in through a glance, a silence, a line delivered too honestly. They never called it love. Not on paper. Not in interviews. Not even to each other. But on the set of The Godfather, it was impossible to miss. Between the rehearsals and retakes amid the shadows of war rooms and wedding scenes, something bloomed in the spaces the cameras didn't capture. A connection. A quiet pulse. Diane Keaton and Al Pacino Kay and Michael were falling for each other. Slowly, carefully, silently. In front of the camera, their characters struggled. Kay loved Michael. Michael, in return, loved her in a way that felt distant, reserved, consumed by power and secrecy. But behind the scenes, Diane and Al were discovering something altogether different, a tenderness untouched by ambition. The days were long. Coppola was a perfectionist, the actors under pressure. Marlon Brando commanded attention. Al shrank deeper into his method. But Diane, she became his anchor. She made the darkness easier to bear. She brought coffee when he hadn't slept. She cracked jokes when the weight of the role turned heavy. And for the first time in years, Al smiled without trying to act like he meant it. She made him laugh. No one had ever done that before, not like she did. Not with such ease, such affection, such curiosity. And Al? He watched her like she was a scene unfolding in real time. Diane wasn't classically beautiful, but to him she was radiant. The way her hands moved when she spoke, the way her thoughts wandered mid-sentence, she was alive in a way he had never dared to be. They began sharing dinners after wrap, long walks through backlots, quiet conversations in trailers between setups, but still no labels, no declarations, just a sense of belonging. They were both too afraid to claim. Their love didn't shout, it whispered. On screen, the tragedy of Michael and Kay was inevitable. A man seduced by power, a woman slowly left behind. But off-screen, Diane and Al were still hoping for a different ending. One where silence didn't become goodbye. There's a photo from that time. Diane in costume, sitting on a folding chair, legs crossed, smiling at something just off frame. Al is standing nearby, cigarette in hand, not looking at the camera, looking at her. That photo says more than 1,000 interviews ever could. It wasn't a love of grand gestures or dramatic declarations. It was the kind of love that lives in glances, in shared silence, in the invisible gravity between two people who don't know what to do with everything they feel. Success doesn't always bring people closer. Sometimes it builds walls, tall, glittering ones, and calls them destiny. After The Godfather, both Diane Keaton and Al Pacino began rising like stars caught in separate constellations. The world was watching now, applauding, demanding. And Hollywood, like it always does, asked them to become more than what they were. Diane found her voice. With Annie Hall, she wasn't just acting, she was redefining what a female lead could be. Nervous, intellectual, quirky, vulnerable, honest. She walked into a man's world in men's trousers and made it hers. The role wasn't just written for her, it was her. And for it, she won the Oscar. The world fell in love with her awkward grace. She became a symbol of a new kind of woman, Independent, self-aware, beautifully complicated. She was no longer just Kay Adams. She was Diane Keaton, the woman who made imperfection desirable. Al too soared, but his was a different flight. With Scarface Dog Day Afternoon Serpico and The Godfather Part 2, he became the embodiment of the American anti-hero. Tormented, explosive, iconic. He gave voice to every man broken by systems too big to fight. His eyes darkened. His silences grew louder. His performances shook the screen. But with every role, he moved deeper into isolation. Fame suited Diane like sunlight. She let it warm her, but never burn her. But for Al, it was fire. It consumed him. The pressure to disappear into character, to prove himself, to live up to the myth, it left little room for anything else, especially not love. They were both flying, but in opposite directions. He buried himself in work. She built a life. He turned inward. She opened up. He feared permanence. She longed for it. Still, the connection remained stubborn, invisible, unyielding. Diane once said, "When I love someone, I love them forever." But forever doesn't always mean together. They would see each other at events, shared glances, polite nods, occasionally a short embrace. But the energy had changed. Not colder, just farther. Like two stars that once touched but now danced on separate orbits. And maybe that was the tragedy of it. Not that they didn't love each other enough, but that they loved each other in ways that couldn't survive the speed of success. Al once admitted in an interview, "I didn't know how to live outside the work." And Diane, she knew how to live without needing to be saved. The distance wasn't sudden. It was slow. The kind that creeps in when no one is watching. The kind that fame doesn't announce but quietly demands. They no longer held hands, no longer whispered line between takes, no longer went home to the same silence. But in the years after the spotlight shifted and their romance faded from public memory, Diane Keaton and Al Pacino remained quietly, stubbornly in each other's lives. Not in the way most people imagined, not as lovers, not as friends who called on holidays, but as something more haunting, more permanent, observers, shadows, witnesses from afar. Diane, now an acclaimed actress and director, would often appear unannounced at Al's theater performances. She'd sit in the middle row, hidden beneath one of her signature hats, and simply watch. She wouldn't go backstage afterward. She wouldn't leave notes. Just her presence, silent, steady, like a lighthouse he may never reach, but always knew was there. Al, too, followed her journey. He'd mention her name sparingly in interviews, always with a tone that felt more like a sigh than a sentence. When asked about past loves, he'd pause, then smile, a flicker of something unspoken. And he never watched "Something's Gotta Give" in public. Too personal, he once told a friend. They existed like two train tracks, parallel, close enough to feel the vibration of the other, but never touching again. People assumed they had moved on. Diane adopted 2 children, Dexter and Duke, and built a home full of art music and wild garden roses. Al remained a storm of talent and turmoil, fathering children late in life, yet still retreating into the quiet when the curtain closed. But there was always something unfinished between them, a conversation that never happened, a confession never spoken, a love that remained untouched by time, preserved like a letter never mailed. At a 2010 gala, they stood only a few feet apart, cameras flashing, applause rising. Their eyes met for a split second. Diane smiled first. Al nodded gently. Then they looked away, not out of discomfort, but reverence, as if acknowledging something too sacred to disturb. She once said in an interview, "Some people stay with you even when they're not in your life anymore. Al is like that for me, always close, but in silence. That silence became their language, a language of glances across crowded rooms, of old scripts tucked in drawers, of memories only they could decode. A language that said, I remember, I miss you, I still carry you. They never revisited the past, never reopened the door. But they never locked it either. Because some connections don't need constant contact. Some loves don't need reconciliation. Some people become a part of you not in grand reunions, but in quiet continuities. It was never an argument that ended them. No dramatic scene under pouring rain. No phone thrown against the wall. No final, tearful confession. The end, when it came, arrived gently, almost respectfully. Like an old friend placing a hand on your shoulder, whispering, "It's time." Diane had waited, not for a ring, not for a promise carved in stone. She waited for something far more delicate, a moment of courage, from a man who had spent his entire life running from it. But Al Pacino didn't run because he didn't love her. He ran because he did, and he didn't trust himself to love her right. He had seen what love became under pressure. In his childhood, love was conditional. In his fame, it was performative. And with Diane, it was terrifyingly real. Real enough to need nurturing. Real enough to require presence. Real enough that he feared he would destroy it simply by being himself. And so he pulled away. Not all at once, but gradually. Missed dinners. Postponed visits. Words unsaid. Then days unspoken. Diane, ever patient, began to realize the silence wasn't temporary. It was his language, a language of absence, and after a while, even the strongest heart must choose peace over waiting. So one day she packed her things, not out of anger, but acceptance. She didn't ask him to chase her. She didn't leave a note. She didn't cry. She simply walked away from a love that had once saved her, but could no longer carry her. "I loved him," she would later say, her voice steady but soft. "I really truly loved him. But we were complicated. And I couldn't spend the rest of my life being the only one fighting to make it simple." And Al, he didn't stop her. He watched her go, standing in the hallway, cigarette between his fingers, trying to memorize the sound of her footsteps so he could pretend later that she was still in the next room. In the years that followed, he would speak of her rarely, but when he did, his voice changed. Less of the gravel, more of the ache. "She was the best part of me," he once muttered almost to himself during an off-camera moment. And Diane, too, kept him close, not in photos, but in the way she raised her children, in the roles she chose, in the books she read alone at night. The goodbye wasn't an explosion. It was a whisper, a silent agreement between two people who had loved deeply, but couldn't keep living in a space where one longed to be held and the other only knew how to disappear. It had been years since they had shared a set. Years since they'd exchanged more than a few words in a crowded room. Years of headlines, heartbreaks, and history pulling them further apart. And then, in 1989, fate, or maybe irony, brought them back together. The Godfather. Part 3. Francis Ford Coppola wanted to close the trilogy, to bring Michael Corleone full circle. And for that, he needed Kay. He needed Diane. And with her came something neither she nor Al could have fully prepared for: a reunion with the person who had once held their entire heart and let it go. They arrived on set as professionals, older, wiser, more guarded. Diane had become a mother figure to young actresses in the industry. Al had cemented his legacy as a living icon. They were no longer the curious kids from the 70s. They carried their own weight now and their own wounds. At first it was awkward, polite, almost too careful. But then came the scene that would change everything again. Michael and Kay sitting together in the courtyard of a Sicilian villa. The years between them heavy, their love fractured. She looks at him half bitter, half tender. He looks at her broken, but hopeful. A man asking for forgiveness without knowing how to ask. As the camera rolled, something happened. The script melted. The past rose up. And what was meant to be a performance became a reckoning. When Diane said, "You're still not listening to me," it wasn't just Kay speaking. And when Al whispered, "I will always love you," the line didn't feel like acting. It felt like confession. The crew knew. The director knew. Everyone on set could feel it, that this wasn't just a scene. It was two people living through a moment they had avoided for decades. After the cut was called, there was no applause, just silence. Diane walked away, wiping her eyes. Al lit a cigarette with shaking hands. That night, they didn't go to dinner together. They didn't relive old times. But something between them shifted gently, permanently. The distance that had grown between them didn't vanish, but it softened. Like old scar tissue that no longer hurt, just reminded you where the pain had been. It would be the last time they acted together, their final dance on screen. One that mirrored the truth of their off-screen journey, not the perfect ending, but a true one. Years later, when asked about that moment, Diane would only say, "We said things we never had the courage to say before, but through someone else's words." And Al. He never spoke about it, but in his eyes, in that scene, in the pause between every line, the truth was there. No camera rolled, no clapperboard snapped shut, no director called action. And yet what happened that day on the quiet Sicilian set of The Godfather? A Part 3 may have been the truest scene Diane Keaton and Al Pacino ever shared, and the only one no one ever saw. It was late afternoon. Filming had wrapped early due to a lighting issue, and the crew had dispersed, some to adjust equipment, others to grab a late lunch. The courtyard emptied. The villa exhaled its heat, and the hum of production dulled into the background. Diane sat on a worn stone bench in costume. Her shoes already off, ankles crossed, thumbing through the yellowed pages of a book. Her head tilted, her shoulders relaxed, not acting, not rehearsing, just being. A rare sight for someone whose entire life had often felt like performance in layers. Across from her, leaning against the shadowed arch of a wall, stood Al. He didn't move, didn't interrupt, just smoked slowly, one hand in his coat pocket, watching her, not possessively, not longingly, but with a quiet awe. Like he was memorizing the lines of her face for the 100th time, afraid one day they might blur. No words passed between them. But if you listened closely, you might have heard something more profound than dialogue, the sound of two lives brushing past each other again. After all the years, after all the missed moments, after all the things left unsaid. The air was thick with stillness, not of awkwardness, but of reverence. There was nothing to fix, nothing to explain, nothing to rehearse. Just Diane reading in a patch of Sicilian light, and Al watching like a man who had once known her heart and never quite forgot how it beat. A junior crew member walked by quietly and later said, "I don't know what I saw, but it felt like I was intruding on something sacred, like a goodbye written in silence. There should have been a camera. There should have been a frame. There should have been music swelling to meet the weight of the moment." But some love stories are too delicate to capture, too real to direct. Because that wasn't just a woman and a man sitting quietly in the ruins of a shared past that was closure, the kind that doesn't come through grand gestures, but through mutual knowing. through peace. Diane would never speak of that afternoon. She never needed to. It belonged to no one but them. And Alul, he would smoke alone on his balcony in New York from time to time, gazing into nothing. A faraway look in his eyes, as if still holding on to a moment the world missed, but his heart never did. That scene never made it into the film. But maybe it didn't need to, because some scenes, the most important ones, aren't meant to be watched. They're meant to be lived. When love doesn't stay, some people collapse. But Diane Keaton she created. In the years after her quiet farewell with Al Pacino, she didn't drown in nostalgia or grow bitter in solitude. She did what she always did when life gave her silence. She filled it with meaning. She built a home, not just a house, a world. Far from the chaos of Hollywood's red carpets and fleeting romances, Diane moved into a Spanish colonial house in Beverly Hills. She restored it by hand, tile by tile, arch by arch, with the same meticulous care she once poured into every scene. Brick by brick, it became her sanctuary, her own cathedral of peace. No man's name on the mailbox, no one to share the mortgage, just her. She filled the walls with art, the shelves with photographs, the rooms with color, imperfection, warmth. Her home wasn't perfect, and neither was she. But in that imperfection, there was authenticity. It reflected the woman she had become, unapologetically herself, full of contradictions and gloriously free. And then, without announcement, without a plan, she adopted a daughter. Dexter came first, then Duke. Not because she needed to check a box or prove something, but because Diane understood that love could take many forms. If she couldn't build a life with a man who feared commitment, she would still build a life overflowing with commitment anyway, to children, to art, to truth. There were sleepless nights. There were fears. There were days she doubted herself. But she embraced motherhood not as a replacement for romance, but as a transformation of it. She became her children's safe place, their storybook, their chaos, their compass. Professionally, she continued to surprise the world. Something's Gotta Give, The Family Stone, Book Club. She played women who weren't chasing fairy tales, but redefining them. Women who were older, bolder, flawed, and funny. Characters who mirrored her, refusing to fade just because the world told them they should. She no longer needed a co-star in life. She had become the director. And yet, in the quiet corners of her interviews, in the pauses between anecdotes, the ghost of a memory would sometimes return. A name unsaid, a gaze that drifted slightly to the past. Al. Always Al. Not in anger, not in regret, but in a kind of gentle ache. The kind that reminds you some loves don't disappear. They just stop appearing in photographs. Diane Keaton built a life that was never defined by who she married, because she didn't. Never defined by who stayed, because most didn't. She built it on her own terms, with her own hands. And somehow, that made it more than enough. Every legend, no matter how luminous, eventually hits the dark. For Al Pacino, that darkness arrived in the 1980s, not in a sudden crash, but in a slow, hollowing drift. His name still carried weight, but the weight grew heavier. The roles lost clarity. The scripts lost soul. The world, once obsessed with the fire in his eyes, began to wonder if the flame had gone out. He was tired artistically, emotionally, and perhaps spiritually. Film after film failed to connect. The critics sharpened their pens. The box office numbers dropped. And for the first time in his towering career, Al Pacino felt replaceable, irrelevant, quietly falling. And then Sea of Love, a detective thriller with heart. A role that asked not just for performance, but for truth. It came at a time when Al no longer believed in his own voice. But Diane did. She always had. She saw the script first, heard the character's voice before he did, knew in that strange, instinctual way only someone who once loved you can know that this was his path back. She called him not with urgency but with calm certainty. Read it, she said. No pitch, no pressure, just belief. A belief she had carried quietly for years, even as their lives had moved apart. Al read the script, and in it, something awakened. It wasn't just a role, it was a mirror. A chance to be vulnerable without losing his edge. To feel again. To matter again. Sea of Love opened to acclaim a box office success, a critical revival. Suddenly, the name Pacino wasn't a relic. It was reborn. The performance didn't just rescue his career. It reminded the world why he had once been untouchable. But Diane's name. It never appeared in the credits. No one knew. No article told the story. No award show acknowledged her hand in his resurrection. And Al. He didn't thank her on camera, didn't write a dedication, didn't say her name at the premiere, but years later, buried deep in the pages of Sonny Boy. His introspective, fragmented memoir sat a single sentence, 7 words, no context, no flourish, just truth. She saved me, he wrote once, without even asking why. He never explained it further. Didn't need to, because in those 7 words lived a lifetime of gratitude. A whispered confession too sacred to scream. Diane never responded. She didn't need to. She had never loved him for the applause. She had never asked to be the hero in his story. She was simply there always, even when not. That was her gift. And maybe also her curse. The woman who gave, not because she hoped to be remembered, but because she couldn't bear to watch someone she once loved forget who he was. It was 2024, nearly 5 decades after The Godfather first changed their lives, when Diane Keaton stood once more beneath the spotlight. This time, not as a character, not as Kay, not as Annie Hall, but as herself. She was being honored with a Lifetime Achievement Award, and the room was full of applause, full of memories, full of people who had walked through her films like pilgrims searching for truth. Dressed in her signature white suit and wide-brimmed hat, she walked onto the stage, still quirky, still elegant, still unmistakably Diane. She smiled, she waved, and for a second, her voice cracked not from age, but from something deeper, a weight that had waited years to be felt. As the standing ovation roared around her, the camera panned across the crowd. And there near the back, away from the flashes, almost hidden in the shadow of the balcony, stood Al, alone, unmoving. And then slowly he rose. He didn't clap like the others. His hands stayed by his sides, his expression unreadable. But he stood, and in that single act, he said everything he had never said aloud. No speech, no bouquet, just presence. He had come. Not for the public, not for the cameras, for her. Diane didn't look at him right away. She began her speech filled with humor and self-deprecation. But then, mid-sentence, she paused. Her eyes scanned the crowd, and when they landed on him, she stopped. Just for a beat, a flicker, a breath. The kind only 2 people who once shared a soul could feel. She didn't say his name. But the room, the world, didn't need her to. Her voice steadied. She continued. But something had shifted. Her smile was softer now. Her words slower. And when she spoke of gratitude, she added almost beneath her breath, "To those who stood by me, even when they didn't know how." Al sat before she finished. He didn't wait for the end. Didn't want to be seen. But he had seen her one last time. not through a lens, not through nostalgia, but as the woman he had once loved, the woman he had never truly stopped loving. And Diane, she had received many awards, but that night, that gesture, that silent rising, that was her real standing ovation. Not from the Academy, from the man who had watched her become herself, quietly, always from a distance, always standing. They were never engaged, never moved in together, never shared a bank account or exchanged matching keys. There were no anniversary dinners, no diamond rings, no long honeymoon walks on distant shores. No headlines ever called them a power couple. No tabloids ever caught them holding hands at award shows. But still, there was love. The kind that never had a name, but always had weight. The kind that wasn't written in ink, but carved in memory. Diane Keaton and Al Pacino didn't follow the script. They weren't a couple you could define. They didn't offer the world a fairy tale. What they gave each other was something quieter, stranger, and infinitely more enduring. It was the way Diane always spoke of him, with a half smile and a pause, as though she had walked through a storm and still kept the scent of rain in her hair. The way Al never quite answered when asked who the great love of his life had been, only looked away as if the truth was too sacred to say aloud. They never put a label on it, because to name it would be to limit it. And this thing between them, this bond built from scripts, silences, and stolen glances, could not be caged by words like girlfriend or ex. It was something messier, something older, something rooted in the unspoken understanding that some connections don't need daily contact to remain alive. They lived on opposite coasts, had children in different decades, built lives that never intertwined again. And yet, even in the stillness of their later years, they continued to move in quiet orbit around one another, like twin stars separated by distance, still caught in each other's gravity. When Diane stood on a stage, Al watched from the shadows. When Al's name came up in conversation, Diane's voice always softened. And in private moments, when the world wasn't looking, they each carried memories that never asked for closure, only permission to keep existing. It was a love that lived between the roles they played and the people they became. It never needed to be celebrated. It just needed to be remembered. And they did not in loud declarations, but in the hush of a song they once danced to, in the flicker of a scene they once shot, in the ache that never really left. Some people say love must be named to be real, but Diane and Al proved otherwise. Theirs had no title, no status, no ending, just presence, just trace, just truth. A love without a name, but with echoes that refused to fade. It started as a scene, a line on a page, a moment crafted by writers and shaped by a director's vision. In The Godfather, Kay stands before Michael, heart-bruised eyes pleading, asking for honesty, for connection, for some flicker of the man she once believed in. "I came here because I care for you," she says with trembling restraint. In the story, it's fiction. But for Diane Keaton and Al Pacino, it was something else entirely. That line spoken decades ago, long before the pain, long before the distance became something neither of them could escape. Because in truth, Diane had come into Al's life for that very reason, not to conquer him, not to change him, but because she cared. Because she saw a soul beneath the silence, a man beneath the myth. And in turn, Al, though he rarely said it, carried that line like a secret prayer. Not just a performance, but a confession he never had the courage to speak as himself. Over the years, art and life blurred. Diane wasn't just playing Kay, she was Kay, the woman waiting for love to speak first. The woman who eventually chose herself when love could not choose her back. And Al wasn't just Michael Corleone. He was the man who stood at the edge of emotion, unable or unwilling to name it out loud. And so the words written for their characters became the truth they couldn't voice off-screen. Each time Al called her the soul of Kay, he wasn't just praising her performance, he was naming the part of her he had memorized without ever learning how to keep. And Diane, in interviews and memoirs, always returned to The Godfather. Not because it launched her career, but because it captured a chapter of her life that was too personal to rewrite. That line, "I came here because I care for you," was not acting. It was the most honest sentence she ever said to him, hidden inside a film seen by millions. A love letter, disguised as dialogue. A truth spoken safely through someone else's story. They never spoke about it directly, never broke the illusion. But both of them knew in that scene, in that moment on that set, they weren't pretending. They were revealing. And perhaps that's the cruel beauty of being actors. Sometimes the truest parts of your life are the ones the audience thinks are fiction. But Diane and Al knew the truth. They had lived it, and no one could ever take that away. She never married. He never settled. And yet, when the world speaks of Diane Keaton and Al Pacino, they speak in past tense, as if what they shared had an end, a chapter closed, a curtain drawn. But love like theirs doesn't follow a timeline. It doesn't climax or conclude. It simply exists, quiet, steady, unclaimed by the rules of this world. Diane Keaton showed the world something radical, that you don't need to wear a white dress to live a full, fierce, unforgettable life. That solitude can be sacred, and motherhood can be chosen, and a home can be built with your own hands. That a woman doesn't need to be completed, she can be whole all on her own. And Al Pacino, in his own unspoken way, proved the opposite truth, that even a man who runs from commitment can love someone for a lifetime. That you don't need a marriage license to be haunted by a single face. That sometimes the greatest heartbreaks are not the ones that explode, but the ones that fade and never fully let. Between them was a bond that refused to fracture. They didn't need to be together to remain connected. The love never left, it just changed form. It became a memory, a gesture, a glance across a theater, a line spoken decades ago that still carried weight. It lived in the spaces between public appearances and private thoughts, in the way she mentioned him only when it mattered, in the way he kept her photograph even when others faded. And when Diane left this world quietly, privately, without fanfare, it was Al who whispered the last truth, "I love you forever." No headlines captured the full meaning of those 4 words. No obituary could define what she meant to him. No award ever honored what they were to each other. Because some stories aren't made for Hollywood endings. Some stories live beyond scripts and screens and human understanding. They live in silences that hum like music, in hearts that keep beating in rhythm long after they've drifted apart, in souls that never stopped listening for one another. Diane and Al never gave the world a wedding, but they gave it something more enduring, a love that didn't need to be declared to be known, a love that didn't need a name to be real, a love that even in goodbye never truly said the words, because it didn't need to end, to remain eternal. It only needed to be. And if this story touched a part of your soul, if you've ever loved someone in silence, from a distance, or forever, then don't let this just be a story that fades. Subscribe to our channel for more true stories of legends of love and of the emotions that define us all. Because some truths are too beautiful to keep quiet. This tribute video is a creative and emotional storytelling piece and does not reflect real-life events.